and you dispel it for them and they don't believe you and they vote right wing anyway, well then like she's proving my point, which is like you're not going to win on ideological grounds. You're not going to win presenting them facts and saying like, you're wrong about immigration. They don't give a shit about that. But like if you go and say, well, you know what, the people that you're voting for are the reason that you can't afford to go on a holiday this year, then they'll listen to you then. And all I'm saying is that we should let go of the wokeism as defined by the right and like let go of like fighting on battlegrounds as defined by them and just go back to our original battleground of choice. She got 400,000 subscribers. So what does Alice do with her time? Let's check out Alice first before we listen to her. Why female rage is here to stay. Bonjour. That's it. That's all she writes. I'm French, video essays, an educator making videos on topics I'm curious about. Oh, so she just does anything. Ah, okay. Defense of Wokeism. We're weirdly obsessed with cars. Luigi Mangione, activist or terrorist? Dun, dun. I ask the hard questions. Let's see if she's worth her salt then. Let's have a look.
Okay, so today I want to do something a little bit different. This video is about political strategy, which is a very conflictual topic, but that's a good thing. You're very welcome to share your perspective in the comment section, but I'll kindly ask you to first consider the points I'm making and not jump to conclusions before I fully develop my argument. I was motivated to make this considering some of the recent discourse in left-wing circles, especially after all the elections that we went through last year. I've had some strong reactions at times, not gonna lie, but I really took my time to write this video to make sure my arguments are based on data, on science, on my humble experience, and not on drama. Ultimately, my goal is that the left becomes stronger, and to do so, we need to have the best strategy possible, so here's my take on it. Before I start this video, I want to give you a little bit of context as to who I am and why I think my opinion on this matters. My name is Alice, I'm French. I grew up in the north of France, an area that flourished during the Industrial Revolution with the textile industry and the coal industry, but later suffered from deindustrialization and became one of the poorest areas in France. Poor but proud is the murder of the town my dad grew up in. When I was 2, my parents moved out of Lille to go to French Flanders to get closer to nature. I spent more than 20 years of my life in the countryside and go back frequently. My mom was quite involved politically. She also volunteered at a local refugee camp as a nurse. In French Flanders, we have a few of them for refugees traveling to Calais and then to the UK. I liked to join her every now and then because I could practice the English that I had learned in my books with the refugees. People in the area didn't really like the refugee camps. Some of my relatives weren't big fans. In fact, my mom and my other relatives are on completely opposite ends of the political spectrum. I think that growing up with them has taught me a lot about the psychology of the far-right vote. It helps me answer questions like, are far-right voters inherently racist? Are they just frustrated? Aren't far-right voters ashamed? Or are they just dumb? That attachment to my far-right relatives and my background has also made me very skeptical of all the things we hear about morality, far-right voters, etc. I think my area is especially interesting to study if we want to understand the rise of the far-right. In fact, it's known in France as the lab of the far-right. It's in the northern coal mine areas that the French far-right, the National Rally, won its first municipality in 2014. That's where the vote went from left to far-right. The coal mines were predominantly socialist or communist. Up north, in Flanders, a conservative area, the vote went from right-wing to far-right. Almost all our representatives in the north are from the National Rally. This phenomenon happens in my area, it happens in France, in Europe, in the US, in a lot of globalized neoliberal countries. So now that you understand my perspective, I want to debunk
Globalized neoliberal countries.
Or nuance a thing we hear a lot when talking about politics. That thing is that people who live outside city centers are a bunch of depressed, uneducated racists. I want to change your perspective on that, and once that is done, I'll explain you why that leads me to defend Wokism. This idea of the depressed, uneducated racists versus the enlightened, urban progressives is everywhere. On TV, on social media.
You could put half of Trump's support.
She's been on the Deprogrammed podcast. Elect a clown, expect a circus.
Into what I call the basket of deplorables, right?
It is also confirmed by the maps we see after elections. Look at this one, for example, in the US, or this one in France, also this one in Italy. The little dots that you see are often cities lost in a sea of red or black or blue, depending on the map. So this is a territorial approach of politics. Journalists love it because it's very visual, it's very binary. That's why we see those maps all the time. In fact, we see them so much that we've fully integrated them in the way we do and talk about politics. On the left side of the political spectrum, we're very uncomfortable with those maps. We don't want to be perceived as some sort of detached urban hipsters. We don't want to be a little dot in an ocean of depressed, uneducated racists. This anxiety has pushed some left-wing commentators and politicians to change their strategy, to talk to that sea of far-right voters. In France, for example, we hear left-wing politicians appeal to French patriots, the meat eaters and the cheese lovers. The sausage was at the heart of communist leader Fabien Roussel's campaign.
Non, Fabien, tu ne gagneras pas avec un steak!
Great source of memes, this guy. Some other left-wing politicians do everything they can to avoid talking about the topics that make the rural voters angry. The Middle East, feminism, trans people, Arabs, POC. But is that a good strategy? Should we appeal to those voters in the first place?
One problem. Go on, hit us up.
Who are the depressed, uneducated racists that everyone talks about? Are they really depressed? Are they really uneducated? And are they really racist?
It missed my last comment. Why is that happening? This is happening more and more. Maybe it's just you, Reality Pixel Media. You've been censored.
So we're gonna take each word separately. Let's start with depressed.
Like, okay, can we just hone in on the style of video creation here or narrative play that's going on? She's decided. I have never described right-wing people who are angry as depressed before, uneducated or racist. Maybe the racist one, but like not the uneducated or the depressed one. She's setting the narrative, and now we have to go through and deconstruct each one of these terms for her. Anyway, let's go with the language that she's using, like the particular terms, and then we'll have to deconstruct these terms and what they mean.
We often hear that people living outside city centers, in rural areas, are the losers of globalization. They've been left behind and are now frustrated. Well, that's a very biased view of rurality, one that projects the belief of urban people onto rural people. Urban people tend to believe that their lifestyle is the best and that everyone craves it. On the contrary, many rural people don't understand why someone would pay an extortionate amount of money to live in a box in a crowded city. A lot of people in the countryside actually enjoy living there all year round. They have a special connection to nature, plenty of space, and a strong sense of community because of how stable everything is. Now, don't get me wrong,
If you treat everything with an identity politics hammer, everything is an intersectional nail. Yes, yes, 100%. Because like this way of dissecting rural versus urban is not looking at their material conditions at all. It's just like, oh yeah, they're described as depressed, uneducated. Like these two comments in and of themselves have no relation to their material conditions. Like, are they all depressed? Who said that? Are they all uneducated? Like some of the people in like rural Australia are some of the most educated people you will find in the country, because like they are literally the richest people in Australia, because Australia is traditionally an agricultural powerhouse. And so our bourgeoisie are agricultural, or a big section of our bourgeoisie anyway.
Some rural areas are struggling because younger generations are leaving, which causes a lot of worry. But that is not the situation everywhere. And even in challenging situations with public services disappearing, schools closing, etc., rural people take pride in figuring things out with the help of locals. Sociologists explain that resilience, personal responsibility, and small solidarities are very strong in rural areas. The assumption that the red and black parts on the election maps are full of depressed people who feel left behind and angry isn't entirely accurate. Now let's move on to the next word, uneducated. We often hear
All right, let's move on to it, shall we?
that the left has lost the working class vote, implying that the rise of the far right is the result of votes shifting from the left to the right. This has happened to some degree, such as in formal industrial areas like the coal mines, but it's not the whole picture. In fact, I would argue that it's not even the main driver. Looking at recent elections in France, and similar trends appear in other globalized countries, sociologist Vincent Tiberge observed two things. First, there's a sense of resignation among two groups, the working class and young people. Second, there's an increased engagement from one specific group, older conservative voters. To put it simply, working class people don't vote that much. But yeah, those who vote are shifting more and more towards the far right. This can be explained by two reasons. The first one is that they put religion or identity over class. Trump, for example, largely won the white evangelical working class vote, but lost among other working class groups, except white men. Harris won the other groups, but it is true that the Democrats aren't doing much to engage more voters. That's why the working class don't really vote. They don't feel represented by any party. The second reason why working class people went from the left.
Okay, so the thesis here, if what I'm understanding from what she's saying, is that like in countries where voting is not mandatory, you have most of the working class just abstaining from voting. And so if you have most of the working class abstaining from voting and it appears like there's a rightward shift in politics, then that is actually not representative of a working class shift to the right. It's just the fact that like the people that are voting are more right wing. So like it's the working class actually that are abstaining from voting, which is the problem, as opposed to them having more of a right lean and a tendency in the modern era. So that's an interesting theory, but it doesn't hold any weight in a country like Australia, because like we are mandatory voters here in Australia. And like I can tell you from my understanding of speaking to very working class people in Australia is like their leaning is not to the left. Their leaning is against their own class interests and like towards the right, because of like the poison, which is like mainstream media or right commentators' rhetoric on like this dog whistle word, which is wokeism, and using it to beat over the head like anyone that's kind of socially progressive. And so like people do have this perception that like the left is completely detached from reality because it chases after like woke agendas, whatever that means anyway. And so like embracing the class struggle again and prioritizing the class struggle is not an issue. If anything, it is a way to speak to a majority of people in their own language. And like this theory that she's propagating here, I guess it would hold validity in systems where voting is not mandatory, but where it is, like I'm struggling to see the point, like unless she's going to develop it and I'm just not giving her a chance. I don't want to be unfair. What is she even trying to say? Like what's her point? Is she trying to claim that minors are depressed because of where they live, that forms their worldview? Are we going to get the Liberal Party again? Or I don't know, it's a good question. It seems like she's not talking much about how the press manufacture consent. I think that is a big part of the conversation here. Just really obsolete variables. Yeah, very kind of empirical view of things, not based in a material kind of analysis, which is like the big kind of argument that like Marxists would use against liberals. Is like it's based in vibes and empirical data in isolation, as opposed to looking at things like dialectically or as a totality.
Right, and that's more from my personal experience talking with former communists, is because they really believe what the media says regarding migrants taking over their and their children's jobs.
Okay,
but anyway,
there you go. She's talking about some media beat up there. There's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel there.
Went from the left to the right, and that's more from my personal experience talking with former communists, is because they really believe what the media says regarding migrants taking over their and their children's jobs. But anyway, all I wanted to say here is that the hyper-focus on the working class can prevent us from looking at the real threat here. The major boost for the far right comes from increased engagement among groups that used to vote for right-wing parties. These include conservative voters and an increased number of young men who previously leaned center-right. Neither group is necessarily working class. The young men may have attended college, and the boomers, even though they don't have a college degree, have accumulated some.
Whoa. So just because somebody has attended college doesn't mean that they are precluded from being part of the working class. Okay, so this is where like you start to get a divergent kind of understanding with like people that are, I guess, more on the intersectionality side of leftism, as opposed to kind of the working class side or the material objective side of leftism, if you can call it that. Having a college education does not mean that you can't be working class. Like we watched a lot of documentaries last week on like how China built their working class, and like their working class was built on the back of like engineers and scientists helping produce their industry. So like just having an education doesn't disqualify you from being working class.
Economic capital. Different social classes vote for the far right. Sociologist Benoît Coquart notes that imitation is powerful in rural areas where communities and hierarchies are stable. Influence can flow through family businesses, service provider interactions, or casual spaces like pubs or sports clubs. A decade ago, the imitation vote in these areas leaned right-wing. Now it's increasingly far-right. It was taboo just a few years ago to admit voting for the far-right. It was considered un-Republican and serious. Now it's more socially acceptable. So are people voting for the far-right because they're dumb or uneducated, as we often hear?
Okay, so there's obviously a clear distinction she's got between right-wing people and the far right. So she's saying that, like, you know, people who would have voted for the right wing before are now voting for far right. So like she is now making distinction between people who are voting between different degrees of right wing. So like Before, people wouldn't go there and openly admit that they were far right, and now it's more socially acceptable. That doesn't negate the fact that these people might be working class. Just because they vote right wing and they used to vote right wing and now they're far right doesn't mean that they can't be working class. So like, you can still appeal to people that are right wing voters and far right voters with working class issues, because they might have working class interests. So just because they used to vote right wing and now they vote far right doesn't mean that they aren't working class. I hope she's going to make that distinction. 50% of my comments piss off the algorithm. Really? What are you writing? You're in trouble. Equality. She's talking about the Overton window. Yeah. Okay.
In liberal media. Well, no. The far right has been normalized, sure, but that doesn't mean its supporters are brainless puppets with zero agency. From my personal experience, living, debating, and canvassing in the lab of the far right for years, I can tell you that even when we debunk the far right lies or expose the absurdity of their representative statements, most of the people we talk to still want to vote for the National Rally. A lot of people don't want to hear this, but that's the hard truth. You have to trust me on this. I've had up-close personal experience with this over more than a decade. I've seen people supporting the far right despite major changes in their political agenda. From pro-social to pro-business, from anti-Europe to pro-Europe, the only thing that remains stable throughout those changes is anti-immigration. They are not tricked into voting for a racist candidate. I've had many debates and fights that led to this conclusion. They know what they're doing. More and more people are doing the same thing. The Overton window is shifting. Racism is becoming acceptable. They can be racist and remain respectable people. That's a smooth transition onto the last word, racist.
And like, I'm struggling to see the point here. That because racism is being normalized, so then what, we can't talk about working class stuff? Struggling to see what the point is here, but like, I'll let her finish. Sorry.
Let us ask ourselves that question once again. If people vote for the far right's program, even after we explain its inherent racism, does that mean that they're all racists? Some leftists will say that voters aren't racist, but that they are misplacing their frustrations. They'll say something like,
our societies have never been so tolerant. Sure, you'll hear racist takes here and there, but those can be corrected.
Now, it is true that our societies are increasingly tolerant. This is measured in surveys asking people their views on gay marriage, abortion, and other identity-related issues. Even the far right has become more tolerant in its quest to appear more media-friendly. I made an entire video explaining how they try to appeal to gay men and women. I mean, the far right is unquestionably hostile towards LGBTQ+ people, women's rights, and people of color, but they talk to them by adapting their us versus them framework to fit their fears. So they tell women and gay people that they will protect them by getting rid of archaic and dangerous migrants. They tell POC that they want to penalize the welfare queens and Islamists, not the hardworking, assimilated POC. Now, the fact that they have to do all that fake progressivism is proof that they're met with resistance. Sure, more and more people are embracing racist discourses. The resistance is not strong enough, and I'll explain why in a second. But it's important to note that there is still some resistance. Now, where does that resistance come from? Well, let me go back to where I started, with my experience of rurality. I grew up in the countryside with parents who didn't have a degree, who kept me and my sister curious, but didn't give us the tools to think like I think today. I didn't know much about political science, sociology, philosophy until quite recently. I was, like most good students in my area, pushed towards engineering, medicine, or law. Then I randomly stumbled upon commentary and video essays, and I loved it. It allowed me to understand politics, something I've always loved, in a completely different way. I also changed degree from law to English studies, so that can lead me more into the humanities. But yeah, I learned so much, mostly through online resources, books, lectures, all sorts of educational content. All of that allowed me to bring contradiction in conversations where only one side was shown. I've had countless debates with people who had classist, anti-feminist, racist, or transphobic takes, and I was happy to be in those conversations to bring nuance and challenge people's preconceived beliefs. I know what I do isn't revolutionary, but this is what I mean by resistance. The reason why society remains tolerant, the reason why the far right has to appear progressive, is because there are people like me, the wokes, equipped with their toolbox, bringing contradiction, educating people.
That's not the wokes, okay? Being progressive is not being woke. I think there is a distinction needed. I think we need to ensure that we are distinguishing between what the right wing use as a dog whistle to smash anyone who is like potentially trying to fight for working class issues, and we need to make sure that we can define and articulate well what is being described as wokeism by right-wing politicians, by right-wing media outlets, by right-wing thought leaders. We need to delineate by what they describe as wokeism and what like the left would just describe as like socially progressive and like just not being a douchebag kind of thing, like being someone who doesn't discriminate against other people. So like if if she's out there like fighting against people that are racist, which has been happening for fucking ever. Communists have been doing that forever, fighting for women's rights. Like the first feminist ever was a socialist, a French socialist, who like well predates like Marx and anything like that. Like they defined, like they came up with this idea of being a feminist, like supporting women's rights movements and all that sort of stuff. And so like that well predates the idea of wokeism, and well predates intersectionality, which is something that appeared in like the 1980s. And so you can have there is a definite distinction and delineation between what it means to be left, so like someone who challenges capitalism at its core and sticks up for working class ideas, and being woke, or like the idea of intersectionality. I think it's important to delineate between those things and like cut out the right-wing dog whistle part of wokeism. Like we just get rid of the term like altogether. We don't need it. We can be socially progressive as kind of, you know, anti-capitalists, let's say, without having to use a term now that has lost all meaning, that has lost absolutely all meaning, and like I said, has been like completely co-opted by the right wing to use as a weapon to undermine any real working class effort out there. And like, you know, it's just being used by people that are like generally kind of racist and anti-immigration and all that sort of stuff. It's a right-wing tool. It is now, which is really unfortunate. And so like to want to die by wokeism, live and die by it, like it actually means anything to us, like it doesn't mean anything to me. Like let them have it. If they want to say that wokeism is bad, fucking go for it. That doesn't mean that we have to start being assholes and dismissing like civil rights movements, and being dismissive of like anti-racist campaigns and anti-sexist campaigns, and like, you know, we don't have to provide solidarity to those movements. Of course we can provide solidarity, but we'll do it on our own terms. We won't allow dog whistle terminologies that have been completely corrupted and co-opted to like have any power over us. And we should be focusing again on like grassroots stuff, taking it back to like to point one, like to back to basics, ground zero, and then launching campaigns from there. What she was talking about before, which I thought was really interesting, was like how like anti-immigration sentiments are like, you know, you can basically, what she said was, I've been in debates with heaps of right-wing people, and you can basically dispel like the most hardcore, well-believed right-wing fantasy, and like you can dispel it to their face, like right in front of their faces, and like they will just look at you and vote right-wing anyway. Okay, like let's just say that they believe in some racist idea or some like anti-immigration idea, and you dispel it for them and they don't believe you and they vote right-wing anyway. Well then, like, she's proving my point, which is like, you're not going to win on ideological grounds. You're not going to win on like, you know, by presenting them facts and saying like, you're wrong about like racism, or you're wrong about immigration. They don't give a shit about that. But like, if you go and say, well, you know what, the people that you're voting for are the reason that you can't afford to put your kids through school properly, or you can't afford to go on a holiday this year, then they'll fucking listen to you then, because that is their material conditions and that is what they're hurting them. And all I'm saying is that we should let go of the wokeism as defined by the right, and like let go of like fighting on their territorial grounds and battlegrounds as defined by them, and just go back to our original battleground of choice, and one where we will win over like other working class people and their opinions every day of the week, because you hit them in the pocket with conversations. You hit them in the pocket and they're just like, oh fuck, is that really something that's going to affect me financially? Is that going to affect my living standards? Is that going to affect my way of life, basically, like from an economic standpoint? And it will cut through much better anyway. Like, it's not going to cut through for everyone, but it's definitely going to cut through better than like, you know, arguing over whether someone is racist or not, or whether someone is sexist or not, because like they straight away they feel like they have to defend their own integrity, kind of thing. And like in a world where, like she's already noted, where racism is becoming more and more socially acceptable, like trying to argue with someone over why like they're racist or not, or why this opinion might be racist and it's not founded in anything but racism, and it's not actually founded in any reality, like they don't want to fucking hear that. And they're just like, that'll make them double down on like their positions, their far right positions. It's kind of weird. She wants to take up a contrary position and say it's really important, but she's digging in the trenches unnecessarily. Why pander to the right? When talking points, yeah, why go there? Don't meet them at their talking points. The right wing is really good about like with this, and like, you know, like the Republicans do this better than anyone. They fund so many think tanks that just come up with ways of undermining the left, and they spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing it. And as America, as I call this all the time, America is the citadel of world capitalism. All of their ideology, all of the ideology of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist classes, get trickled down through these Republican think tanks and like spread across the neoliberal globalized world as she's described it. And so like you can't fight that type of like ideological drivel that seeps out of like the citadel of world capitalism in a Western sense and just like seeps throughout society. Not even like, you know, the French are safe from this. It's not just an issue for the Anglosphere and people that speak English. Like it drips into their political spectrums as well. And so like you can't fight them on ideological grounds. And I don't think we should be fighting them on ideological grounds. And I haven't heard anything yet that would dispel that theory. But she hasn't finished, so I'm gonna shut up again, I swear, and like I'll let her finish. Everyone has been tricked into believing that they are wealthy. Yes, that's part of the mythology of capitalism, eh? Part of the dream.
We help mitigate the rise of the far right by humanizing what people hear in the media. But we can't resist by ourselves. You know, after decades of neoliberalism, rural areas have been stripped of public services, unions, associations, namely places that typically encourage humanism and communality. We continue to resist at an interpersonal level, but gosh, it's hard. We have very little ways of connecting to each other. Like, I can't help but think about my mother when I have those conversations because she fought for a decade to keep humanist values alive in our area, almost entirely by herself. And she's exhausted now. Correcting individuals' sexist, racist, homophobic, classist, etc. views is tiring, and it cannot properly work if there isn't any law, policy, or programs supporting those changes. So while our societies are generally becoming more tolerant, tolerance alone doesn't stop fascism. When people feel threatened, tolerance quickly evaporates. Far-right politicians prey on this. They basically say to their voters, hey, we won't be able to change your life for the better because that's just how things are, but you are resilient, you're hardworking, not like those welfare queens and snowflakes complaining all the time. In fact, you know what? We can promise you one thing. Your life probably won't get better, but you can rest assured that all the migrants, Black and Arabs, LGBTQ+ weirders, all those people, they will suffer more than you. You'll remain above them. This really taps into people's worst instincts, but it works. Now, I'm not saying that fostering tolerance is not necessary. I'm just saying that it's not the most effective way of fighting racism. It is much more efficient to look at where racism is produced. So
What is your point then? That's a really weird point. Like in defense of wokeism, but like she's saying that like you can't meet them at these ideological battles because like really what right-wing people appeal to is like you're better than everyone else. And you're better than other cultures because of this reason. And so like if everyone's struggling, at least you struggle a little bit less than they do. And so like you go for the struggle then. You go and focus on the struggle as opposed to focusing on like ideological differences between everyone who's struggling. I'm really struggling. I got to see where she's going with this.
Where is it produced? Well, in his recent book, sociologist Vincent Tiberge explained that society's move to the far right is driven top-down. Far-right politicians keep yapping about immigration and insecurity, the media capitalizes on the sensationalism, and then progressively shifts their editorial lines to better incorporate those topics in their coverage. Conservative billionaires now buy services.
This is the manufacturing consent you were speaking of, Wings of Cheese.
Asking stay-at-home moms and retired people looking for an easy way to make money online. Do you feel safe? Is immigration out of control? Those surveys are then commented on TV shows by pseudo-experts with books to sell and ex-followers to gain. All that discourse then turns into policies that institutionalize racist practices. So more power to the police to target Black and Arab communities, fewer resources for people in need of assistance, rights taken away from marginalized communities, and weapons to our colonizer friends. That's why the left needs to have a competitive discourse on those issues with bold policies and programs for minorities and for the working class. Okay, so we covered the racism part, we also covered the depressed and uneducated. Looking closely at all those aspects helped me better understand the far-right vote. All the things I've talked about come from my personal on-the-ground experience, as well as the most recent sociological analyses produced on this topic. So no, people voting for the far-right don't necessarily see themselves as losers. They're not all working class people who went from left to right, those who dared emerge to the far.
Again, she has not defined what working class people means. Like, and if her definition of working class is someone, sorry, who's not working class is someone who has a fucking college education, that's a really dangerous definition of what working class means.
Right, were already on the right side of the political spectrum and have some economic capital. They also happen to be the people who vote the most. So when we look at the scary election maps, that's who we see. As I said earlier, some leftists are getting scarily obsessed with those far-right voters. That leads them to tone down their discourse on racism and the police. They ask us to stop using words like intersectionality, feminism, or gender because it will scare away potential voters. Their strategy is very simple. Shut the woke's mouth up. That is such a depressing view of left-wing politics. When did woke become a weakness? I don't want to get too philosophical in this video, but the word woke has such an interesting history. One of the first known uses of woke in a social and political sense came in 1938 in a song by blues musician Eddie Ledbetter, better known as Lead Belly. The song, Scottsboro Boys, was about the wrongful convictions of 9 black teenagers in Alabama. In it, Lead Belly urges people to stay woke as a warning to stay alert to racial injustices. Its use became more widespread during the civil rights movement and re-emerged prominently in the 2010s with the rise of Black Lives Matter, symbolizing awareness of systemic racism and social inequalities. It's only recently that woke became a bad thing. And that's because right-wing media decided it was a bad thing. So it really pains me when I see left-wing people use it the same way the right does. It's a form of surrender. It validates the right's criticism. The same applies to feminism.
And so what? Like, I'm sorry, I'm failing to see if they have co-opted a word that has really good intentions and like is an over-encompassing word as well. It's not a word like racism. It's not a word like sexism and all that sort of stuff, which singles out people for being discriminatory. Wokeism doesn't single out a bad practice. Wokeism is supposed to be about a form of enlightenment. And if like this form of enlightenment has been absolutely run through the mud now and has lost all of its meaning, then like we move on to another word for the same form of enlightenment. We're not giving up on all of this sort of stuff. I'm definitely not asking people to not fight racism, to not fight sexism and all that sort of stuff. I just think that we should be focusing our attention on the core issue. If we are really revolutionary, if we are anti-capitalist, if you want to describe yourself as socialist and communist and all that sort of stuff, go back to the class warfare and the class struggle. That is where you will coalesce and you will build your strength. That's how you will start a movement and you'll be able to fight all of these battles. But like, it's not a word. Like, do not associate. You cannot compare the word woke to like being racist, like the word racist or the word sexist or something like that. Like, it's not the same thing. They aren't the same words at all, in my opinion, anyway.
Racism or the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, these terms carry so much history and meaning, but we should stop using them because we don't want to scare people away. That's not what the left does. We don't surrender to right-wing discourse. We stay strong when the establishment tries to divide us. Our job isn't to be media-friendly. Our job is to shift paradigms. Have we forgotten the historical role of the left? Our mission as leftists is to politicize people through education or entertainment.
No, wrong. Wrong. That's not the goal of the left. That's the goal of the postmodern left or the new left. That's not the goal of the left. I don't think so anyway. Let's go see where she goes with this here. This is a very postmodernist description of what leftism is. And I think this is where we diverge from one another. She's off on a new left tangent here, which is postmodernism, which is basically a point of surrender, which is what she's criticizing. What she's criticizing here is like, oh, the left shouldn't surrender kind of thing. Well, you know what? In the 60s or the late 60s, the left made a decision and they were just like, oh, look at the Soviet Union. They got it wrong. They weren't right about socialism. They weren't right about communism. We have to redefine what the left is, and we have to get rid of like Marxism and all that sort of stuff. We have to separate ourselves from Leninism and Maoism and all those sort of societies that seem to have been wrong about like communism and stuff like that. So let's redefine what it is to be left. Let us surrender what it is to be left. And they went off on a new left tangent, which was like more about a postmodernist view of leftism. And so like she is arguing that we shouldn't surrender basically, as the left to the right. But like all of the talking points she has, if like she's going to build this conversation on intersectionality, that came at a point in like basically the new left where they surrendered the idea of communism and Marxism and all that type of stuff to the annals of history because the Soviet Union failed, basically. She's arguing against surrender, and that's exactly the type of leftism she's just defining, is that like the left is just people that make sure that like we talk about politics that other people don't want to talk about. That's not what the left is about. It's not about like talking about the politics that people don't want to hear. Like the right talks about political things that like people don't want to hear as well. We just don't agree with them. That's why we don't want to hear it. But like the left is actually forged in class struggle. That's what the left is about.
The left has empowered the working class with the knowledge and structures they need to resist bosses. From the 1960s, feminist, LGBTQ+ activist, and anti-racism movement politicized the personal. They democratized concepts like sexism, racism, and homophobia so that people could politicize their personal experiences of discrimination and organize to fight for a better society. The left empowered people who did not vote to finally play a role in society.
And it's funny, like these things that she's talking about like sexism, civil rights, racism, all that sort of stuff. You know who these left people were that were on the front lines fighting for the civil rights movements, were fighting for gay rights, were fighting for women's rights? It was fucking communists. It was like the American communist parties and stuff like that. They were the ones that were fighting these battles. It is the left, in terms of the working class left, that is at the forefront of all this sort of stuff. My big argument is like we go back to the working class movement. We got to go back to the working class movement and root ourselves once again in this solid foundation before we, you know, spread ourselves too thinly over like individual struggle issues.
Still today, the feminist movement, anti-racism movement, and LGBTQ+ movement bring millions of votes to the left, but now we are told we shouldn't talk about those issues because we scare potential voters away. It's the exact opposite. You know, I feel like the scary maps and binary Twitter discourse are really messing us up. We panic, we think we've lost our influence, we become obsessed with those people who don't vote like us, we want to police them at all costs. As a result, we progressively get away from our mission. We indulge in petty criticism against the wokes, and our opponents love to see that. So let's stick to the mission, which is to politicize through education in the form of activism, infographics, books, essays, video essays, commentary videos, music, films, sports, etc. These materials are especially helpful for people resisting in far-right territories. They've been super helpful to me, a rural science girl turned left-wing influencer. So yeah, this was in defense of wokeism. We first nuanced the stereotypes of the depressed, uneducated racists to better understand the sociology of the reactionary vote, and then we explained that the best resistance strategy isn't to stop using supposedly controversial words, rather we must stay true to our core mission as left-wing people. Educating and politicizing. That also means staying strong in the face of the anti-woke backlash and focusing our energy on those who resist, not those who divide. Now to conclude, I want to acknowledge that there are detrimental tendencies on the left side of the political spectrum. I wish we had an easy term for it, but the only phrase we have now is political moralism. That phrase is found in Wendy Brown's essay Moralism as Anti-Politics. More recently, Adrienne Mary Brown also published Loving Corrections. Both connect in the sense that they differentiate between morality and moralism. I said I wouldn't get too philosophical in this video, but I need to do this just for the conclusion. Brown explains that people motivated by morality are powered by good sentiments. They want to make the world a better place. However, people who are motivated by moralism are powered by bad sentiments. In Moralism as Anti-Politics, she says, quote, "It is when the telos of the good vanishes, but the yearning for it remains, that morality appears to devolve into moralism in politics. It is at this point that one finds moralizers standing against much, but for very little, adopting a voice of moral judgment in the absence of a full-fledged moral apparatus and vision." End quote. Basically what she says is that when there is no political vision, no agenda, no bold measures, then we turn to moralizing, meaning policing individuals. She views political moralism as a symptom of a lack of political vision. In other words, if we think that we can't change the system, we're more likely to resort to policing individuals. This is actually another feature of what right-wing media and a certain amount of left-wing people called Wokism. You know, the virtue signaling, the performative activism, etc. I don't personally use the term woke. I prefer something like, conscious crusader or hyper hip or virtue god. Tell me your favorite one in the comments. But anyway, this is where things get interesting. Wendy Brown sees moralizing tendencies in another group, She says, quote, "Alternatively, the moralizer refuses the loss of the teleological and becomes reactionary, clinging without logical ground to the last comforting frame in the unraveling narrative: pluralism, the working class, universal values, the movement, standpoint epistemology, a melting pot America, a woman's essential nature, whatever it was that secured the status of the true, the status of the good, and their unbroken relationship." End quote. That little quote is a bit technical, I had to reread it many times, but it basically says something I've always felt but struggled to articulate. That's why I decided to sit down and make this video to find answers. When Brown talks about the moralizers, she doesn't just include the conscious crusaders, hyper-hippo virtue gods, you choose which one you prefer, she also includes the anti-woke. She put them in the same basket. Brown says that the wokes and those who criticize the wokes by claiming that we should go back to universalism, to their romanticized view of the good old working class, are actually much more similar than they think. Both groups surrender in the face of adversity. They don't want to work for a bold political vision. They've lost faith in revolutionary ideals. So they turn their energy to hyper-policing for one group, or romanticize nostalgia for the other group. Both do so in a very selfish way. It doesn't come from a place of goodness, it comes from a place of frustration and bitterness. It doesn't help us get closer to our political vision. It actually divides us. I mean, it's okay to have conflicts within the movement. It's okay to focus on one cause more than the other ones. It makes us, as a movement, grow and refine our mission. However, systematic.
Well, I think that's what she's saying. She's saying, like, woke is revolutionary. Like, I'm sorry, I'm really struggling to follow her arguments here. She's really conflicting in a lot of the stuff that she's saying, and like, I'm not handling this one very well. Like, to be honest, like, what she's saying is, like, if you just want to like focus on like the working class and the romantic struggles of the left, like, kind of thing, you're just as bad as people that are anti-woke, because, like, you know, you're associating with people that don't care about progressive issues, and that makes you unrevolutionary. And like, I'm sorry, but like, that comes from people that don't have a proper understanding of what it takes to be anti-capitalist at the end of the day. Like, the left, this is where it's divergent, and this is why I pointed to it before. The left was founded in the struggle between working people who are exploited in this system and like a group of people that are doing the exploiting and benefit off the system. Everything else is a refraction based on that core internal social relation. And so like, all these refractions are horrible. They're very, very bad. And like, she's saying that we need to fight all of these refractions because that is revolutionary in and of itself. And it is on the basis of looking at all of those individual refractions, all of the like the thousands and infinite possibilities of struggle that result through this core exploitative relationship. And she's right, like, revolutionizing each one of those individual struggles, each one of those individual forms of oppression would be revolutionary in and of themselves. You could have a revolutionary struggle in every single form of like problem and oppression out there. And like, that would fix those things for a time being until, like, you know, they crept back into being problems again under a capitalist mode of production. But like, if you really wanted to go after the big issue, like, and like reducing it back to the class struggle, that's not just romanticizing things and like, you know, pining for the good old days of being lefty where it's just like the working class against the world. No, that's wanting to address the problem with this mode of production. So like, she is looking at this solely from the perspective of the new left, as it was defined after the 1960s, and because people started taking a postmodernist kind of view of the political spectrum, which is like, there's no more grand narratives for anything anymore, and like, it's really all about the individual and the individual's like experience within the totality, within the system. And so like, we need to recognize individuals and go after individual struggles, as opposed to having these grand narratives which dictate kind of what's happening in society. And I would reject that and say, no, we should go back to this grand narrative, because we can all coalesce around it. We can anchor ourselves on it, and we can fight all the struggles we need to on the side. We can do whatever we need to, but we should anchor ourselves in something, and we can still do what we need outside of that. We can fight those individual struggles additional, but we need to anchor ourselves in something. and like not just float on a sea of like fighting oppressive struggle after oppressive struggle based on individuality. We need to anchor ourselves in something, and so let's anchor ourselves in something which is common, like a material condition, which kind of is common ground for most people in the working class that feel the burden of capitalism. We just need to start to referring back to French Revolution, left versus right premise. The irony of the disconnect from the tennis court from a Frenchie. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's rather strange how it's been twisted, actually, because I get what she's saying. Like, let's not let go. Like, let's not surrender to the right. And like, who the fuck wants to surrender to the right? Fuck the right. Like, if they are able to dictate what the conversation is because they have the media power, they have the think tanks, and like they have basically they have the machinery in order to do this on a global scale. Like, who the hell wants to surrender to that? But like, if you want to learn anything, like, let's go back to Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which we were talking about like last week. Like, let's just acknowledge that this is a battleground. Politics is a battleground, and like a revolutionary struggle is an absolute all-out war, and this is a class war. Like, no one wants to surrender. Okay, no one wants to surrender. It's just saying we don't surrender, we don't give in, like, kind of thing. And it's just like, no, that's not true. Sometimes you do have to cede territory. Sometimes you do have to surrender on certain things that don't actually meet the final objective. That teleological issue that she was talking about before. Let's not give up on the theology, which is like, you know, looking down and saying that the means will like get us to a certain ends. If you actually care about that teleological stuff, we're like actually getting to the ends and saying that these means the way of doing it like this will get you to the end. If you care about the ends, then you will secede. You will cede certain territories. You will surrender certain battles in order to maintain the war on the ultimate objective. And the ultimate objective, in my mind here, is undermining the capitalist mode of production. And then we can rewrite the book on all of these other struggles that she's talked about, like all of the struggles against, you know, racism, sexism, attacks on people's sexuality, individual struggles, and like the infinite ways in which individual struggles can be fought. We can redefine all of those battlegrounds and like take them up separately, and better if we like kind of attack them at their core and displace the mode of production which runs through everything. I think we can definitely surrender. We shouldn't have to surrender, of course not. Like, it's not fair that like someone should, like a group should like co-opt what it means to be woke. Like, it's really unfortunate that has happened, but it has happened. Like, let's be realistic about this. Like, let's actually be realistic and play the game that's in front of us. So like, if we have to kind of backtrack a little bit and like, you know, let them play with the word woke, like the right that is, because like it's a dog whistle for their people, then let them have it. Let them have it, and like just focus on material issues for people for a little bit and then get back into that territory. Then like, let's do it. Let's just play the game that's in front of us. There's nothing wrong with that. I disagree on her surrendering sentiment, that we should never surrender on anything, because like, you know, that's what we do on the left. Like, we die by the sword. Well, like, if you want to die by the sword, you go for it. You go and die by the sword. But like, you know, once everyone's dead and there's no one left to fight the revolutionary struggle, that's what I'm really concerned about. And that's why, like, you know, if you go on to like the Patreon page and stuff like that, the fucking tagline is like, keep revolution alive. We have suffered significant losses on the left and in the fight against capital. We need to keep the idea of revolution alive. We need to survive. This is a war. And like, we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is a war, because like, people are like her because of the divergent new left status that she has taken from like that point in the 1960s where it became less about class warfare and it's more about like every problem that could be out there and why we need to fight against every problem, which are problems, don't get me wrong, but like, you know, it is already coming from a point of surrender. And like, it's starting, like the left is starting to detach itself and just floating off, becoming kind of this detached political ideology. It's becoming just like a battleground of everything that is anti-right. The left now and this is, I've said this a number of times, and I'm like developing this idea, but the left today is defined only by the right. Like this, like if you had a criticism of wokeism, it would be this, that wokeism, or like the left as defined by like the woke issues, are just reactions to right-wing issues, reactions to right-wing people being racist. It's a reaction to right-wing people being sexist. It's a reaction to right-wing people being anti-transgender or anti-gay or anti-immigrant and all this sort of stuff. The left shouldn't be defined by reacting to the right. The left should be defined in something of its own, and that is the class struggle. And so we should never forget that. We should never forget that we have our own origin, and like we don't just have to be reactionary left-wing people. Like that's something that we need to coalesce around. We are the reactionary left, and that's what I am truly worried about. All right, let her finish.
Systematically refusing to talk about one or multiple causes, or even devalorize those causes, is profoundly counterproductive. Making fun of wokeism has become the acceptable way of downgrading minorities and their struggles. People who do so on big media platforms want to target liberal elites, the urban hipsters, and show themselves as more down-to-earth, in touch with real people. They don't understand that outside urban spaces, people use words like feminism, queerness, POC, neurodivergent. It's not because the map is black or red or blue that we're not there. We are politicizing people, we are getting more voters. Like my beautician, for example, who recently divorced a dangerously controlling man. She was sharing her story and dropped some feminist terms here and there. I was not expecting this. In 2 years, she'll be campaigning for the left, trust me, I'm working on it. But yeah, we've seen countless political commentators starting to criticize wokeism, hoping to reach people beyond urban circles, but it doesn't work. The only thing they get is sympathy from those who already don't like wokeism because they don't like social justice. It's good for business, true. Being anti-woke brings a lot of views, etc. But it's not good for the left. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching.
So look, I get what she's saying. We shouldn't surrender. But like, damn, like you got to play the game that's in front of you. I think she's not realizing that she's taken up a sectarian thinking. She's actually saying, unless you're woke, you're against the cause, which isn't true. Yes. Why is it a surrender if activists converge onto the class struggle? Yeah, why is that a surrender? Like she calls it romanticism and stuff like that. Why is that antithetical to what it is to be on the left or something like that? Like I am really interested in that type of that idea, that framework, that mental gymnastics, because that was the mental gymnastics was what I was getting from the person that I've been arguing with online. It's just like, well, if you're not with us, then you're against us. And like my point is not that. It's just like, well, like let's just focus on something else now. Let's like try and win some of the working class back. What's wrong with winning the working class back and talking to them about their like issues that affect them, as opposed to like battlegrounds that we want to win on because we know it's right. But like I just want to make it clear that like socialism has its roots as a negation of capitalism. So like capitalism is a wonderful mode of production. It's incredibly effective. It's raised a lot of people out of, I guess, abject poverty. And when you say that, it's like more like feudal style poverty. It's given people increased living standards, access to goods and services and things that like we've never been able to conceive of as a species before. But like it does so on the back of alienating labor. So it like combines groups of laborers together, detached from one another, detached from the means of production, detached from any will and intelligence that they might have in improving the system or having a say in the system. Like the machinery they use and the tools that they use even coordinate them. They dictate to them what they are supposed to do. They're completely separated from the produce that they are making. But the value and the observation is that they are groups of people coming together to produce value. Capital gets labor together. He describes it, Marx says, combination of labors. So like labors as this abstract idea, this idea of all these individual workers coming together to do stuff, and it brings them together forcibly. And so like if you wanted to summarize socialism in like one word, it would be like bringing together combinations of labors unforcibly or voluntarily, and allowing them to control the means of producing value. And so like socialism is not the struggle to not surrender wokeism to the right wing because you know it's right and they shouldn't have taken it off us anyway. I don't think it's got anything to do with that. Like, that's really an unfortunate reality, and that's what she's saying. We shouldn't have to surrender this, and I agree. We shouldn't have to fucking surrender any of this stuff to them and to like these right-wing think tanks and right-wing political activists and political commentators and all that sort of stuff. We shouldn't have to surrender any ground to them, especially if we know that they're just assholes. But like, those assholes have been able to manipulate the situation in their favor. Any good military commander, any good strategist, they know when to retract and when to push forward. And you can't just push forward forever because like you run out. Like, she described the situation of her mother for like, 10 years trying to fight for stuff that no one else wanted to fight over, and she was explaining like how it just destroyed her mother kind of thing, and she feels sorry for why is she asking all of us to destroy ourselves as well? Like, let's just focus our energies on something. Like, let's focus our energies on something that grounds us all, an anchor point. And like, if we need to come back to certain things at later stages, then so be it. There's no shame in that. And like, it just seems like there's a bit of pride going on here.
Remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.
I am on Patreon. Please follow the link in the description and sign up for free. We are trying to build a revolutionary community over there. So go become a member for free and join the conversation. If you can contribute financially, that would help a lot.